Hello class, I thought I'd do a quick update video here on week 4 where we're looking at lesson 5. Just a quick heads up, in addition to the normal assignments that'll be due this week, Saturday before midnight as usual on lesson 5, with the discussion posts as well as the quiz. There's also the Unit 1 exam to do as well. So make sure you don't forget that. That's worth a whole lot of points, 70 points total. And make sure you give yourself, at least I would say an hour to do this. It's 30 multiple choice questions and then 2 essay responses that you'll need to do on that. So just a heads up on that this week. Tuesday for seated classes, Monday and Tuesday there weren't any seated classes, but that school closure due to President's Day and College Development Day, that won't actually affect our schedule here with this online class. So just a heads up that assignments will be coming due as usual this weekend, and actually in addition we have the Unit 1 exam also due this weekend. So just a heads up on that. By the way, I also wanted to say great job on the Lesson 4 discussion. A lot of great constructive discussion of the different points of view there and the different responses to the inequality of the Gilded Age. And here we're coming up for Lesson 5. Actually, in Lesson 5, you have 2 options of authors to respond to. You can either respond to the issue of populism and the source Mary Elizabeth Lease, who sort of is an example of a populist speaker in the 1890s. You can either respond to her speech, or you can respond to Grover Cleveland in this article advocating U.S. intervention abroad against the Spanish Empire, especially over Cuba, which Spain was kind of arguably abusing and trying to suppress an insurrection there, which was not only making conditions harsh for people living in Cuba, but also was threatening American investments and property in Cuba with potential destruction if the fighting continued to go on there. So you can actually choose between which one you want to respond to. You can respond to this source on populism, or the source on kind of U.S. foreign policy in the 1890s. So domestic policy or foreign policy. And regarding the domestic policy and the populist movement, it's kind of a new take on Gilded Age inequality that arguably kind of tries to semi-straddle the line between some of the extremes you saw last week. Those 4 authors you saw last week. Here I'm going to show a quick little diagram that sometimes I show my seated classes. I haven't posted this on for this online class, but I'll go ahead and show it and maybe briefly explain it, because I do think it's kind of interesting and maybe is one way in which you could group different political theories and different political currents. So the basic idea of this diagram is, from top to bottom, this axis basically determines kind of how much government power you want over society, and namely, especially, how much control you want to give the government in order to enforce some sort of unity in society and overcome conflicts and divisions in society. So this side of the diagram would be like an all-powerful government, very strong authority, public authority, for forcing unity on society, whereas this side would be very minimal government, and kind of hoping that kind of contracts and negotiation, the individuals can arrive at some sort of unity or harmony through kind of those voluntary legal mechanisms down on this end. So from top to bottom here, you kind of have an axis of more government versus less government. That's kind of a very basic way of understanding this. And then left right has to do with, if you are going to use government, to kind of manage the conflicts in society? Should the government focus more on managing cultural conflicts or managing economic conflicts? And you could have the government doing both. When you have the government do both, it kind of ends up in this part of the diagram here. And you could have someone who's like kind of an ultra-centrist who wants some government, but, not complete government, and who wants the government to manage, economic conflicts as well as cultural conflicts. I would actually kind of put Franklin Roosevelt during World War II kind of maybe leaning slightly left to center, but he kind of, as we'll see, does a little bit of everything. Has some economic policies that do involve some economic redistribution in order to smooth out the economic conflicts in society that arise from economic inequality. So he has the government playing that role to a certain extent, not to a total extent, like a complete communist, but to a sizable extent. But he also has things like the Japanese American internment camps. Is forceful using government to enforce some sort of some sort of unity in culture, in civil society, prioritizing kind of perceived security and stability at all costs, even if it comes at the expense of certain minority groups, which, if taken to an extreme extent, would kind of start verging on fascism, which I would say for the most part, Roosevelt doesn't quite go there. But things like the Japanese American internment camp, arresting people who haven't really been charged with any crime specifically, on the mere suspicion that they may be disloyal, does kind of start to sound a bit like fascism. And this diagram also helps explain why at the most extreme end, fascism and communism can have some superficial similarity, because both, often use very strong, almost you might say totalitarian or domineering government power to enforce that unity in society at all costs. With the slight distinction being that at the end of the day, the communists ultimately focus more on kind of the economic unity and leveling out economic differences, whereas the fascists, spend relatively more attention on leveling out kind of cultural differences. But communists may use the government to police culture. Fascists may use the government to regulate the economy. Or fascists may use the government to regulate the economy. So there's some overlap. That's why this is called a horseshoe theory of politics. Like the extreme ends of the horseshoe can kind of end up bending back towards each other, and showing some similarities at the extremes, paradoxically, where the far left and the far right can kind of almost start looking like each other a little bit. So if we had to, put where last week's Gilded Age authors would land on this diagram, I would probably say Herbert Spencer is somewhere down here, maybe slightly center right, but mostly, down here in this extreme kind of libertarian thing where he really doesn't want the government to be doing hardly anything other than protecting individuals against violence. He doesn't want any economic redistribution. You could say maybe there's some gesturing, his idea of letting kind of the unfit die off, kind of gestures in a way that some people are unworthy in society, or they have bad morals or habits, and once again, if taken to an extreme, that can kind of start sounding like fascism. I don't think Spencer goes quite all the way in that direction, but so I'd kind of put him somewhere here, maybe down here. If you see where my mouse is. Andrew Carnegie, he's probably somewhere right here, because he wants a little bit of economic redistribution. He wants maybe not the government, but some people to be in charge of smoothing over the class conflict and decreasing the wealth gap between the ultra rich and the ultra poor. But he also kind of has a paternalistic attitude where he also kind of wants this wealthy elite, including himself, to kind of oversee working class culture and, you know, uplift workers insofar as he sees fit, you know, not just giving workers a wage increase, but, you know, insisting on still paying them relatively low wages, but then giving the money back to the workers in the form of public libraries or other things that will uplift them culturally, intellectually, educationally, which has a vaguely kind of, you know, semi-right-wing tone in terms of, you know, wanting some sort of authority to kind of police what should be a normative culture, not just leaving it up to workers to decide for themselves, which to me kind of sounds vaguely right-wing. So he's got some left-wing and some right-wing, you know, aspects, and he's not an ultra-free marketeer. You know, he doesn't want to just have unbridled accumulation of wealth at all costs without any sort of regulation. Now, he's not really calling on the government to regulate. He's calling on other wealthy people to voluntarily kind of regulate how much money they accumulate and to give some of it back. So he's not going, Carnegie is definitely not going all the way in favor of total government, you know. So I'd put Carnegie maybe somewhere over here. Then you have Edward Bellamy, socialism, you know, obviously the government taking a very strong role in basically running the entire economy, running every productive enterprise, which, to be clear, you know, when socialists were talking about that, and also just to be clear, Bellamy called his system nationalism because he didn't like the sound of socialism, but really it was what I would call socialism. You know, keep in mind, socialists were not talking about like forcing people to share toothbrushes or little minor, you know, personal possessions of that sort. Really what they're talking about was like businesses being completely run by the government, you know, major productive assets. So, you know, maybe he's not talking about full communism like Lucy Parsons was. You know, so Bellamy I would put somewhere over here. And then Parsons also somewhere over here, maybe even more extreme far left. And when you get to the anarchists, it gets kind of confusing because the anarchists will say that they are against any form of government, but they also want some sort of authority to be in charge of kind of administering the wealth of society. Presumably it'd be some sort of decentralized, kind of directly democratic authority. But they're definitely not like ultra free marketeers just wanting to leave the economy up to, you know, the free market, like a, you know, a classical liberal or libertarian would be, like Herbert Spencer. So, you know, where to put anarchists on this diagram is kind of a little confusing. Definitely anarchists of Lucy Parsons' flavor, where they have some affinity with communism, you know, I would put them kind of over here. They definitely don't belong down here. Down here, you know, if someone called themselves like an anarcho-capitalist, where they wanted to combine a lack of government with kind of a free market capitalist system, then I would put them kind of down here. Parsons I would kind of put over here, somewhere close to Edward Bellamy, really. So notice there's kind of, you know, you got the one extreme kind of over here. You got another cluster, Carnegie, Spencer kind of over here. You know, notice that this whole part of the political spectrum isn't really represented yet in any of the Gilded Age authors we've looked at. And in fact, really, there weren't really any people in any country quite yet that, you know, had anything resembling fascism. Fascism really arises for the first time in kind of the 1920s. You know, places like Italy, for example. So we've yet to really see that, and we also haven't really seen anyone kind of in this center-left area yet. But that's exactly what we're going to see in Lesson 5 with the populist movement, where the populist movement doesn't want to go as far as Edward Bellamy and having the government run all of the major economic enterprises, you know, basically being the sole employer in society. But the populists do want the government to run some industries, industries that they feel like are inevitably going to be centralized, like the railroad network, the communications network. And thus, if they're going to be centralized, you might as well have them accountable to voters rather than owned by one mega billionaire, robber baron. That's kind of their thinking, at least. So they want some government ownership of some industries, not all industries. They want some government regulation. They want some taxation that goes disproportionately on the shoulders of the wealthy, but they don't want to completely take away all the wealth from the wealthy. They want to break up some industrial monopolies, but they also want to allow some room for small businesses to thrive through the free market. So, they're not just complete kind of libertarians that don't want any government regulation, but they're also not kind of this far left. They're kind of this center left option. So if you were someone who maybe as you were reading those sources in lesson 4 and thinking to yourself, well, gee, all these are kind of too far in the extremes. What about some, point of view that maybe splits it down the middle and tries to take the best from each? Maybe if you were thinking that, then the populist political platform in lesson 5 will appeal to you. I'm curious to see what the class has to say on that, if you find it appealing. And also, we're going to see in lesson 6 the progressive era. The progressive movement is kind of something that's slightly left of center. It once again kind of splits the difference between maybe the populists right here and the free market people right here. Progressivism is it's kind of a slightly less firebrand version of populism in a way, wanting to do a lot of the same things that the populist movement wants to do, like regulate business, break up monopolies, except they're a little less firebrand about it. We'll talk about how the progressive movement and the progressive era have a lot of overlap with the populist movement, but slightly diverge from them in some respects. So I would put the progressive movement in the early 1900s in lesson 6 somewhere right here. I put the populists right here. Socialists and anarchists go right here. Herbert Spencer down here, or maybe over here. And Carnegie's kind of somewhere here in the middle, maybe. So that's how I would organize the different political responses to the Gilded Age situation in America. But I'm curious to see what you all think. What have I missed anything? Would you have a different interpretation of where these philosophies would land on this diagram, or does this diagram make sense at all in the first place, or is this kind of falsely construing and falsely organizing different political viewpoints? Does this even make sense? Those could be some things you could bring up and discuss if you wanted to in the discussion for this week. And I think I've seen a few students have already started posting, which is great. But I look forward to seeing the rest of the class chime in with their contributions. And just once again, a reminder, lesson 5 due, and also the Unit 1 exam due. Make sure you do both before this Saturday at midnight, as usual. All right, best of luck. See you later.